In this video, we'll be talking about software and hardware limits in myCNC, how to enable them, disable them, and change them. So to access your limits, first of all go into your menu, Settings, Config tab, and within the Config tab go into Inputs, Outputs, Sensors, and Limits right here. So here you have essentially two sections, one for software limits and one for hardware limits. First of all, let's go over the software limits and see how they work. So to enable them, first make sure that this check mark is set to be on, because unless it's on, you won't be able to edit any of these values. Next, select the axes that you'd like to enable the limits for. So for me, that will be the X and the Y axis. And then select your minimum and maximum limit. So that will be, let's say for me, I'll have a work table of X negative 600 to X 700, and then Y negative 500 to, let's say, 500. And that will of course depend on your work table and your work area. Next, select the Jog Slow Down option if you'd like to use it. And what the Jog Slow Down option is it essentially allows you to slow down your machine right before reaching the software limit. So for example, if you're moving at a very high speed, the moment you reach the software limit, your machine will stop very abruptly, which is not something that you'd like to see for a lot of the machinery. It can be very detrimental. So we'd like to slow down the machine if possible when it approaches the software limit. So I'll enable this option and I'll select the slow down distance, which for me will be, let's say, 70, and let's say 70 for Y. So when it's within 70 units, in my case it's millimeters, it will slow down to a certain percentage of my speed. So if I'm, let's say, jogging towards the positive X axis limit at a speed of, let's say, 1000 millimeters per minute, then when I'm within 70 millimeters of that limit, it will slow down to 200 millimeters per minute. Alright, so now that we have this sorted out, we can save, and we can go back to the main screen to see how it works. So let's say I will, move back to 0, and start jogging to the positive X-axis limit, which is in my case, I believe, 700. So we're jogging at a speed of 5,000, then we're switching to a speed of 1,000, which is, again, our 20% of our jog slowdown speed. And then when we reach 700, the machine is now stopped and will not move any further. Another thing to note is that, let's say if we set the program coordinate X to 0, so now we're at 0, and we jog once again. Note that the software limits depend not on the program coordinates, so the program coordinates for your particular G-code program, but rather for the machine coordinates, because again, we're only interested in where the machine is physically rather than where it is on the toolpath within the program. Alright, so now that we have this sorted out, I'm just going to 0 the coordinates once again. And now let's go over the hardware limits. So they operate based on your limit switches, so you'll have a negative limit switch and a positive limit switch. So when it approaches the limit switches and when it touches them, the program will be stopped immediately. So this is a little more useful sometimes in cases where you'd like the program to stop immediately, or rather the machine to stop immediately, because if you've noticed, when we're going over to our software limit, it actually takes a second to react and to actually enable this stopping. So here we have went outside the bounds a little bit, simply because, again, this is a software limitation rather than a hardware limitation, so it takes a little bit of time to react. And if we're using the hardware switches, this will be near instantaneous. So for example, let's say I'd like to have a hardware switch at my positive x-axis limit, and let's say I'm using input number 28. So I have a little button connected right here, which you can see I'm currently pressing it. And if I enable it, and I set it to be input number 28, and I set it to be normally opened, so by that I mean that typically the input is not on, and when the input is closed, it means that we have to stop. If it was, on the other hand, let's say red, like this, I would set the input to be normally closed. And if that's something that you'd like to simply flip around, you can always do so in your common hardware settings, where you can have the input bits inversion. So for example, I'd simply invert this bit number 28, and then I'd save the configuration. But for now, let's go back to the limits. We have enabled our positive limit switch for our x-axis at input number 28. We'll save this, and then we'll go back, and let's say I am moving into the positive x direction, and I press this button. We immediately have this end switch plus x pop-up window on the screen, and I can't move any further to the right. I can still move to the left, even though the button is still pressed. I can still move up and down, but I can't move to the right until the button is released. Once it's released, I can move down just as before. Alright, so this should cover the basics of the software and hardware limits. If you have any further questions or you'd like to have more information, please visit our documentation at docs.pvautomation.com.